Having discussed in the previous lecture some evidence concerning the characteristics of multinational companies and their evolution over time, as well as having introduced some of the basic definitions and concepts that allow us to identify what a multinational company is, now we will start with the discussion of one of the first theory that help us addressing the key question that we said will be our main focus for the remaining part of this course, which is why do multinational companies exist? In particular, the theory that we're going to discuss today is discussed in your book in chapters 5 and 6, and it can be generally identified as the product life cycle theory. What is today's plan? So what are we going to do in this lecture? As I was saying, we will ask basically we'll start by asking our main question, which is what explains the existence of transnational companies. So what is it that makes a company willing to become a multinational company? That is to say, to undertake foreign direct investments. And in particular, the key question can be also stated in terms of why do firms decide at a certain point to internationalize their business via foreign direct investments as opposed to just export, which, as we know, is the most common way of doing business at the international level. So what is it that makes a company willing to use FDI rather than export, and which implies what is it that makes a company at a certain point willing to become a multinational company? As I said, in this class, we'll begin to explore some theories that provide some insights into this issue, and we will start with two approaches. The first one is the original approach by Hemers, which is the first author that started to focus on multinational company, and then we will, on this basis, we will study the product life cycle, which is the more general approach that was developed in particular by Vernon. What about Hemers' seminal work? So Hemer, as I said, is the first author who actually, in his PhD dissertation that he wrote in 1960, is the first work who started to focus on the existence of multinational company and try to provide a theory of multinational company or transnational companies. Now, it is interesting not only because it's the first one, but also because it is kind of a good example of what is understood as theorizing that starts from empirical facts. In fact, as we will see, Hemer started to focus on multinational companies because he was observing in the data the existence of these patterns in foreign direct investments, that at the time the concept of FDI didn't exist, actually was introduced by Hemer, but he was observing a lot of productive investments going on from the US to Europe, and he wanted to try to explain what could be that was driving these patterns of investments. So, in particular, the contribution of Hemer must be understood in the light of the fact that prior to him, that is prior to Hemer, there was no actually theory of foreign direct investments. The main theoretical paradigm at that time that was used to explain investments was neoclassical theory, and neoclassical theory, which is discussed at a certain point of the book, we will not cover that part, but just to give you an idea, the main approach in the standard neoclassical theory was to explain investments in terms of across countries, so international investments, in terms of differences in interest rates. So interest rates, if you remember from your course in micro and macro, is the main cost of capital, if you want. So differences in interest rates is the main driver of investments across countries. It was therefore the main driver of capital movements from one country from one country to the other. So in general, all type of investments, of capital investments, were treated the same, and there was no actual distinction between foreign direct investments and what we called in the previous lecture portfolio investments. So FDI were not treated as special case, but were just considered as just one type, one were not treated as international investments as all the other type of investments. And in fact, it's actually Himmer himself that introduced for the first time the concepts of foreign direct investments, and that's why this is also a reason why his contribution is pretty relevant. So, what is the approach of Himmer? So, Himmer starts by criticizing the neoclassical approach, based that, as I said, was based on the differences in interest rates as the main determinants of capital investments, on the basis of several reasons. The first thing is that actually FDI does not necessarily involve movement of funds from the home country to the host country. Why? Well, because if I'm interested in, for instance, acquiring a Chinese company, let's keep my standard example in which I am an Italian company, want to acquire or want to invest or want to get control of a Chinese company, I do not necessarily need to raise capital from Italy and invest it in China. I can directly raise capital from China and invest it in the Chinese company. So, not necessarily foreign direct investments involve movements of capital from the home country to the host country. Okay, that's not necessarily the case, which implies that, of course, you can have this kind of foreign direct investments by directly raising capital from the host country. Secondly, FDI often take place both ways. I mean, oftentimes you observe foreign direct investments that go from Italy to China as well as from China to Italy, and this pattern, this two-way pattern, cannot easily explained on the basis of differences in interest rates. Because, of course, if there is a difference in interest rates, you should observe movement of capital going only in one direction. Whereas, as I said, we observe them going both ways. Finally, FDI tend to be, if you look at again at data, and we already know this, tend to be concentrated in particular industries across various countries rather than in particular countries across various industries. And why this is relevant? Once again, because if the differences in interest rates were the main driver of foreign direct investments, you should observe that what matters really is differences in interest rate across country. So you should observe a pattern in foreign direct investments in which the main driver of these investments is whether they are in one country or another, and they should be distributed in a relatively homogeneous way across the industries of that country. But that is not the case, okay? Because, as I said, rather than being distributed across industries in various countries, what you observe is that foreign direct investments are concentrated in some industries across various countries. So there must be something more than just differences in interest rates that explain the evolution of foreign direct investments over time. So, as I said, these are just two, I will report just some empirical evidence that supports what I just said. This is a graph showing, at the time where Himmer was writing, the foreign direct investments were concentrated mainly in the manufacturing sector. But as we know, this pattern has changed a lot. Nowadays, as is shown by this graph, which is taken from the World Investment Report, what you see is that nowadays they are mainly concentrated in the services. So, what matters for us, with respect to what I was saying before, is that this shows clearly that the concentration of foreign direct investments in some sector rather than other emerges clearly from the empirical data. This is instead a second evidence that shows the patterns of investments across countries, and it shows in particular. Okay, so we already seen this in the previous lecture. Okay. So, having criticized the neoclassical approach, then Himmer start to think about what is it that essentially differentiate foreign direct investments from other investments. And in particular, his point is to differentiate investment by large companies for production purposes, what he actually called foreign direct investments, from purely financial investments, what we called in the previous class portfolio investments. And his demarcation criterion to distinguish between foreign direct investments and portfolio investment is actually control, which is the concept that we still, as we know, we still use today to identify foreign direct investments. In particular, his point was that, which is something that, as I said, is still used today, is an idea that it is still used today, is that foreign direct investments gives the firm control over the business activities abroad, whereas portfolio investments, they do not. Okay, why they do not? Because they are undertaken for completely different reasons. When you make foreign direct investments, you want to gain, you establish a long-term interest in the management of the company in which you are investing. When you make portfolio investments, you just want to earn a short-term return from your investment. So as I said, this demarcation criteria is still valid today, and due to the fact that these two types of investments are conceptually different, it must be the case also that their determinants are different too. So the next step that Himmer makes in his analysis is actually try to understand what these different determinants could eventually be.